We start with the breaking news on the economy. The new consumer price index came in a little lighter than expected. The CPI rose 2.7% in November, year over year. That is less than was expected. These numbers were, of course, delayed by the government shutdown.
51,000 rental listings. And for a young person on youth allowance, not a single rental was affordable. So the report's authors say that this has created a really desperate situation.
Some housing numbers, and brace yourself, there's going to be more than one or two numbers, so pay attention. A third of all American households spend more than 30% of their income on rent or mortgage payments.
If you feel like you're working harder than ever, but somehow falling behind, you're not imagining it. Your parents were given a simple formula. Get a job, show up, work hard, and over time, things get better. You make more, you save more, eventually you buy a house. This wasn't just advice. For a while, it was actually true. For a few decades, something very simple happened. When workers produced more, they got paid more. As the economy grew, their wages grew with it. Not perfectly, not equally, but consistently enough that people could rely on it. Between 1948 and the late 1970s, worker productivity and worker compensation rose almost in lockstep. The economy grew by about 90% during that period. Workers saw their pay rise by roughly the same amount. The mechanism was straightforward. You produce more value, the system routes some of that value back to you. And then, around the late 1970s, that relationship started to break. Workers didn't stop producing more. In fact, they became dramatically more productive. Since 1979, productivity in the U.S. economy has risen by roughly 80%, but wages didn't follow. They went up about 29%. That's not a delay, that's a split. And the split wasn't constant. According to the Economic Policy Institute, during years when unemployment was low and the labor market was tight, wages actually kept up with productivity. In most of the other years, median wage growth was minimal or stagnant. So the connection between effort and reward didn't disappear, it became conditional on factors most workers can't control. That didn't happen by accident. Starting in the late 1970s, a series of policy shifts changed the rules. The federal minimum wage stopped keeping up with inflation. Labor laws didn't keep pace with growing employer resistance to unions. Tax rates on top incomes came down. Regulations that had kept corporations, employers, and the financial industry in check were rolled back. None of these changes were dramatic on their own, but over decades, they added up to a different economy. One where growth still happened, but the gains were distributed very differently. What that looks like in practice is a worker today producing significantly more per hour than a worker in 1979 and taking home only marginally more for it. If productivity gains had been shared the way they were before the split, median compensation would be roughly 30 to 50% higher than it is today. Depending on how you measure it, that's not just a small adjustment, that's a different life. The place this shows up most clearly isn't in a chart, it's in housing. In 1981, the typical first-time homebuyer was 29 years old. Today, it's around 40. And it's not just the age that shifted. The share of home purchases made by first-time buyers dropped from 44% to 21% over that same period. More than half of young adults between 18 and 24 now live with their parents. That's not because people suddenly became less motivated. It's because the math underneath them changed. The median home price in the United States is now around $413,000. The median household income is roughly $84,000. That's a price-to-income ratio above 5 to 1 and higher in many metros. In the early 1980s, it was closer to 3 to 1. The difference sounds small, but it's the difference between something being achievable and something feeling completely out of reach. According to the National Association of Home Builders, nearly 75% of U.S. households can no longer afford a median-priced new home. According to HUD, California was the only state where homeownership was considered unaffordable in 2020. By 2025, that number had risen to 17 states. At one point, housing costs were considered manageable at around 30% of income. Recently, they've pushed past 40%. Nearly half of what a household earns just to have a place to live. And that's if they can afford it at all. For renters, the picture is just as tight. Since 2020, rents in cities like Miami and Tampa have risen by 50% or more. Even in markets that didn't spike as dramatically, the trend has been steady and relentless. You can work full-time, earn a decent wage, and still not be able to afford what used to be the most basic marker of financial stability. And housing is just the most visible example. The same pattern shows up in education, healthcare, childcare. Each one looks like a separate issue, but together they point to something bigger. A college degree costs more in real terms than it did a generation ago. It also returns less in earnings for most fields. Student loan debt in the United States now exceeds $1.7 trillion, a number that barely existed 2 generations ago. Healthcare costs have consistently outpaced overall inflation for decades. And childcare in many metro areas now costs more than in-state college tuition, meaning some families pay more to go to work than other people pay to go to school. The cost of participating in ordinary adult life has been rising faster than what most people can earn from ordinary work. So, where did the gains go? Some went into technology and investment. Some went to shareholders through stock buybacks and dividends. And a significant portion went to the top. In 1965, CEOs of the largest American companies earned about 20 times what a typical worker made. Today, that number is closer to 300 times. CEO compensation grew roughly 3 times faster than the pay of even the top 0.1% of earners, and twice as fast as corporate profits. That's not just a change in numbers, it's a change in how the system distributes value. When productivity grows and compensation doesn't keep pace, the surplus has to go somewhere. It went up. Between 2020 and 2024, the wealth threshold to reach the top 10% of U.S. households jumped significantly, driven largely by rising home values and stock prices, not from paychecks. The top 10% hold over 87% of corporate equities and mutual fund assets. Wages, meanwhile, grew at roughly half the pace of wealth. At the same time, the structures that used to support workers started to weaken. Union membership dropped from roughly a third of the workforce in the 1950s to about 10% today. That matters because unions were one of the few mechanisms that gave workers the leverage to negotiate wages that tracked productivity. Without that leverage, most workers take whatever the market offers. Pensions, retirement plans that guaranteed a fixed income and were funded by the employer, were replaced by 401ks, which shifted the investment risk from the company to the individual. A pension meant your employer was responsible for your retirement. A 401k means you are. Benefits that were once standard, stable healthcare coverage, predictable retirement income, paid leave, became things individuals had to manage and fund on their own. And for a growing share of the workforce, even that framework doesn't apply. The rise of contract and gig work means millions of workers now operate without employer-provided benefits at all. No health insurance through work, no retirement match, no paid sick days. They carry the full cost of being employed on their own. Each of these changes made the connection between hard work and financial security less automatic, not impossible, but less reliable. More dependent on where you live, what industry you're in, and whether the system happens to work in your favor. The advice, though, never changed. People still hear, work hard, be responsible, and things will work out. And for some people, in some places, that still holds. But the system that made it broadly true isn't the same system anymore. It was reshaped by policy decisions, market shifts, and structural changes that most people never saw happen and had no say in. About 37% of American adults say they would struggle to cover an unexpected $400 expense. That number hasn't moved much in years, even as the economy has grown and corporate earnings have hit record highs. And it tells you something about how thin the margin has gotten between getting by and falling behind. So when it feels like you're doing everything right but not getting the results you expected, that's not just frustration, it's structural, and it's in the data. Working hard still matters, it's just no longer enough to produce the results it once guaranteed. And the question worth asking isn't why people aren't working harder, it's why working hard stopped being enough. Where do you feel this gap the most in your own life? Let us know in the comments.